The man you trusted with your prayers, your confessions, and your soul was hiding a crime so unthinkable it would shatter a community's faith forever. This is the chilling story of a priest, a forbidden affair, and a crime that shocked the world. Betrayal, lies, and murder, all hidden behind the sacred walls of the church. In the quiet of a small town where faith was the foundation of everything, Father Anthony was more than just a priest. He was a man revered, trusted, and loved by his congregation. His sermons inspired hope, and his presence gave comfort to the weary. He was the kind of man people turned to in their darkest moments. And then there was Mary, a young woman humble and struggling, who took a job as a housekeeper in Father Anthony's home. She never imagined that this position would bring her closer to the priest in a way no one could have ever foreseen. What began as a relationship of trust quickly turned into something far more complicated. A forbidden connection, kept hidden from the eyes of the world until it became impossible to ignore. A pregnancy, a desperate decision, and ultimately, a crime that no one could have anticipated. This is a story about betrayal, a breach of trust so deep it shook a community to its core. A crime that tore apart not just a life, but the very faith people had placed in the institution that promised to guide them. It's a tale of love, secrets, and ultimately, a murder that nobody saw coming. Father Anthony's journey to the pulpit was one of dedication and devotion. A young man from a small village, he sought solace in the church, and in return, the church gave him purpose. His journey wasn't easy. He worked tirelessly, studying theology and serving in various parishes, until one day he found himself in a position of influence at St. Mary's Church. His sermons were a beacon for many, filled with wisdom and compassion. The community saw in him a spiritual leader, a man whose presence could heal wounds, both physical and emotional. He spent his days helping the poor, visiting the sick, and comforting the grieving. His charisma made him well-loved, admired by everyone who came into contact with him. In the eyes of the community, he was a man of God, a symbol of integrity. But what few knew was that behind the closed doors of his rectory, Father Anthony carried a heavy burden, a secret that would change everything. Enter Mary. A young woman from a struggling family, she had come to the city in search of a better life. She found work as a housekeeper for Father Anthony, a position she believed would be a fresh start. With little money and no other opportunities, the job was a lifeline. It offered her a roof over her head, meals, and a chance to send some money back home. She was grateful for the work, and slowly, she began to trust the priest, seeing him not just as an employer, but as a father figure. She looked up to him and believed in the words he preached every Sunday. Mary lived a simple life, waking early to clean and prepare meals, doing her duties without complaint. But her world began to shift when Father Anthony began taking a personal interest in her life, offering her kind words and guidance. It was subtle at first, small gestures that seemed innocent enough, but they soon grew into something more, something that Mary did not expect. For Mary, the priest was someone she could turn to when she felt overwhelmed by the pressures of life. She believed she was safe in his presence, never imagining that he, the man she trusted most, would be the one to lead her into a dangerous and irreversible situation. Mary's days were long, and her work was never-ending. From dawn until dusk, she cleaned, cooked, and cared for Father Anthony's home, doing everything with a quiet devotion. But as the weeks passed, she began to notice something changing in their dynamic. At first, it was just small moments. Father Anthony would ask her about her day, offer a compliment, or share a laugh during a quiet moment in the kitchen. He'd sometimes linger after dinner, talking to her about life, offering advice, and telling her stories of his own struggles before he became a priest. It felt innocent, like any two people sharing a conversation, but there was an undertone that neither of them acknowledged. Father Anthony's attention to Mary grew more frequent. He began to seek her out more often, offering to help her with tasks, asking her personal questions, questions that seemed too intimate for someone in his position. At first, she didn't think much of it. He was kind, a man of God, someone who could be trusted. But soon, the boundaries between employer and employee started to blur. The small gestures turned into longer conversations, and those conversations turned into private moments. A touch on the shoulder, a lingering gaze that Mary began to notice more and more. What had been a harmless friendship was beginning to feel different. The secrecy around their interactions grew too. The housekeeper's duties were never discussed openly. Whispers in the halls, eyes avoiding contact when others entered the room. It was as though no one could know what was truly happening behind the closed doors of the rectory. And yet, the tension between them became undeniable. But as their relationship deepened, Mary found herself drawn to the attention she was receiving. She began to rely on it, confiding in him more, seeking his presence in the quiet moments of her day. The line between trust and something far more dangerous had begun to fade, and Mary, though conflicted, never quite understood the gravity of what was happening until it was too late. What began as friendly gestures and conversations soon spiraled into something far more troubling, something neither of them had intended. Father Anthony, the trusted figure in her life, had become more than just a mentor. And Mary, caught in the whirlwind of emotions she couldn't control, found herself stepping into dangerous territory. As their relationship deepened, so did Father Anthony's fear. The trust he had once built with his congregation now hung by a thread, and he knew the scandal of his affair with Mary could shatter everything he had worked for. His reputation, the respect he had earned, the trust placed in him by the community, was on the verge of being destroyed. But it wasn't just his reputation he feared losing. The deepening complications of the affair began to weigh heavily on him. Mary's pregnancy, a consequence of their forbidden relationship, was a ticking time bomb that could expose them both. He knew what would happen if the truth came to light. He would lose everything: his position, his authority, and perhaps even his freedom. In the quiet of the rectory, the tension reached its peak. Father Anthony knew that the secret could not remain buried forever. Mary had no intention of keeping the pregnancy hidden. And as the days passed, it became clear that the longer he waited, the more likely it was that someone would find out. The walls were closing in. In a desperate bid to protect himself, Father Anthony made a chilling decision. He had always been a man of control, a man who led with authority. But in that moment, control slipped away, replaced by fear and desperation. He couldn't let the scandal ruin him. And so he took matters into his own hands in the most horrifying way. One evening, as darkness settled over the town, Father Anthony invited Mary into his private study. There he spoke to her in soft, comforting tones, trying to convince her that everything would be fine. But the words that had once been kind now carried an edge, and Mary, trusting him as she always had, did not suspect what was to come. He reassured her that they would find a way to handle everything, her pregnancy, the truth, all of it. But as she turned her back to him for just a moment, everything changed. Without warning, he struck her down. The act was swift and brutal, an attempt to silence her, to eliminate the threat to his perfect life. Mary, caught off guard, struggled, but the priest's grip was unrelenting. Mary's final moments were filled with confusion and fear. She had trusted him, placed her life in his hands, and in return, he betrayed her in the most violent way possible. She never had a chance to scream for help. After the murder, Father Anthony, in a state of shock and panic, disposed of her body. He dismembered her and disposed of the remains in the nearby river, hoping that the water would wash away the evidence of his crime. But the dark truth could not be hidden forever. The brutality of the act was horrifying, but the priest's cold, calculated response to his crime would only become clearer as the investigation unfolded. At first, no one suspected Father Anthony. He had built a fortress of trust around himself, and the community, still reeling from Mary's sudden disappearance, was too shocked to question him. The police were left with nothing but a young woman who had vanished into thin air. Nobody, no witnesses, just an empty house and a community too stunned to speak. Initial suspicions fell on those closest to her. Was it a lover's quarrel? Had Mary been involved in something dangerous? But every lead seemed to lead to a dead end. The priest's alibi appeared airtight. There was no sign of a struggle and no one had heard a thing. The investigation grew cold, and for months there were no breakthroughs. But the case was far from closed. Behind the scenes, authorities were working tirelessly, poring over every detail, every piece of evidence. And in the end, it was a single discovery that cracked the case wide open. A local fisherman out by the riverbank had stumbled across something unusual. A torn, blood-stained piece of fabric caught on a branch. At first it seemed insignificant, but forensic experts quickly determined that the blood on the fabric matched Mary's DNA. It was a crucial piece of evidence that couldn't be ignored. Police scoured the area and found more traces, footprints, tire tracks, and eventually, fragments of Mary's clothing leading toward the church. Authorities now had a trail, and it led straight to Father Anthony's front door. The breakthrough came when a neighbor who had been keeping to herself finally came forward. She had seen Father Anthony's car parked near the river on the night Mary disappeared. She had heard strange noises coming from the rectory, but hadn't thought to speak up until now. With witness testimonies and the mounting forensic evidence, the case against Father Anthony began to take shape. It wasn't just circumstantial anymore. It was undeniable. The arrest of Father Anthony sent shockwaves through the community. The man they had once trusted with their spiritual well-being was now facing charges of murder. But even as the evidence piled up, he maintained his innocence, claiming he had nothing to do with Mary's disappearance. His defense argued that the forensic evidence was circumstantial, that there was no proof he had killed her. But the prosecution had a powerful case. The blood, the fabric, the witness testimony, all pointed to Father Anthony. And as the trial began, the eyes of the entire town were fixed on the courtroom. Was this truly the man they had admired for so many years? The priest who had preached about love and forgiveness? Or was he something far darker, a monster hiding behind a holy facade? Reactions from the church were divided. Some stood by Father Anthony, claiming that his actions were a result of being misunderstood. But for most, the truth was impossible to deny. The priest, who had once been the moral compass of their community, had become the very thing they feared most: a murderer. As the trial moved forward, the prosecution's case grew stronger, revealing just how cold and calculated the crime had been. The defense tried to cast doubt, but the evidence left little room for that. The only question that remained was whether Father Anthony would ever truly come to terms with what he had done, or if he would continue to deny his actions, even as the walls closed in around him. After weeks of testimony, the trial came to a close. The jury deliberated, weighed the evidence, and delivered their verdict. Father Anthony was found guilty of murder, his once pristine reputation irreparably shattered. The man who had preached forgiveness, grace, and redemption was now a convicted killer. The courtroom was filled with an air of disbelief as the weight of the decision sank in. Some could barely look at him. Others, who had once trusted him implicitly, now questioned everything they had been taught. Father Anthony's sentencing was swift. He was condemned to life in prison, the chains of his past sins forever binding him to a fate he could not escape. But the repercussions of his crime were not limited to just the priest. The community, who had once turned to him for guidance, was left in shock. Their faith had been torn apart, and many found themselves questioning the very institutions that had long been pillars of trust and authority. The trust they had placed in Father Anthony was gone, replaced with anger, betrayal, and confusion. For many, it wasn't just the loss of a spiritual leader that hurt. It was the realization that the very person who had been entrusted with the moral guidance of an entire community had used his position to exploit and destroy. In the aftermath, discussions on morality, the abuse of power, and the dangers of blind trust began to flood the town. How could someone so revered have fallen so far? How had the community missed the signs? And perhaps most haunting of all, how many more people had been affected by the betrayal of someone they had believed to be pure? Father Anthony's case became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked authority, a reminder that even those we hold in the highest regard can betray our trust. The community, though scarred, was forced to rebuild, not just their faith, but their sense of safety and moral clarity. The shadow of Father Anthony's actions would linger for years, a cautionary tale about the price of misplaced trust and the devastating consequences of abuse of power. And as for Father Anthony, his life behind bars was one of reflection, a man now stripped of the respect he had once commanded. His redemption would never come. His punishment, though severe, could never undo the damage he had caused. But for Mary, there would be no second chance. She was a victim of the betrayal that so many could never fully comprehend. In the end, justice had been served, but the scars would remain for a long time, for both the community and the broken trust they had left behind. This case isn't just about a single crime or the life of one man. It's about something much bigger. It's about the devastating consequences of broken trust and unchecked power. When those we turn to for guidance, for safety, and for moral clarity betray us, it shakes the very foundation of who we are. Father Anthony was a figure of reverence, trusted by his parishioners, his community, and his flock. But his actions proved that no one, no matter how revered, should be beyond scrutiny. His betrayal of trust didn't only affect Mary, it affected everyone who had placed faith in him. And when that trust is shattered, it leaves ripples that affect everything it touches. The broader implications of this case echo through every institution of power. In religious settings, where trust is paramount, what happens when that trust is abused? What becomes of a community when its leaders fall from grace? And perhaps most importantly, how do we as a society hold figures of authority accountable, especially when their influence is so pervasive? These are the difficult questions that linger in the wake of this tragedy. While Father Anthony's sentencing may have brought some sense of justice, it hasn't healed the wounds left by his actions. It hasn't answered the larger questions about the structures of power, responsibility, and accountability. At the heart of this case is a human story, one about vulnerability, power, and the terrible consequences of betrayal. It's a stark reminder that no one, no matter their title, no matter their role, should be above the truth. And it's a reminder that those we trust with our hearts and our lives must be held to the highest standard. For when they fall, they take us all down with them. This case leaves us with more questions than answers, but it also leaves us with an important truth. The abuse of power doesn't just affect the individuals involved, it reverberates through entire communities. And the healing from such deep betrayal is a long, difficult journey. As we reflect on this case, we are reminded of the importance of vigilance, of questioning those who wield power, and of protecting the trust that binds us all. Because, in the end, trust is the foundation of everything. And when it's broken, the consequences can be more